All right, everybody. Hi, it's me. Thanks for joining today. If it's your first time, I think everybody here's maybe a repeat, but just in case somebody's watching this afterwards, I'm Laurie Lawless and I own Shelter Behavior Integrations, and my whole goal is to help animal shelters and everybody working in animal shelters really integrate more comprehensive and innovative strategies into their shelters regarding animal behavior. And so I have a variety of these talks and also do on-site training and remote consulting. So thank you for being here. I'm really excited to talk about today's topic, which is documenting everything we have going on in the shelter as far as our dogs and their observations and behavior and how that relates to everything, as far as internal pathway planning, outcomes, staff training, like basically everything, and like how behavior is really happening all the time. And, there is no just one behavior team, everybody's on that behavior team. So really excited to talk about that. Before I get started, I just wanted to mind you guys that I'm going to be at the New England Federation of Humane Societies next week. So I will be there. So if you're in New England and you want to attend, I will be offering free short consultations just right there at the booth. I'm going to be at a table with John from Humane Innovations, so that's very exciting. Get to sell cool products and also meet people from all over New England. And for those of you who are going to potentially be going to Animal Care Expo, I'm also going to be doing a day-long workshop with John on shelter safety and handling and processing dogs through intake, which is going to include a lot more behavior forward stuff. So I'm really jazzed about that. So if you're going to either of those events, please reach out to me. I'd love to meet you in person and hang out as much as time allows and really get to know the folks that are in my group. So please feel free to just shoot me a message on Facebook or shoot me an email, and I'm always happy to talk. Awesome. So we'll get started today. And I also wanted to preface this today that if you guys have any questions or any scenarios or something that you want to ask today, please feel free to drop it in the comments. It does help me figure out what's the best way to support you guys when I have some feedback and also some requests. I try to come up with topics I think are really cool to me, but really this time is about you guys and figuring out what's helping or going to help your shelter. So please feel free to use that chat box. I do watch it as we're going through, and I'm happy to answer any questions in this Facebook Live today. So what I wanted to kind of start off with talking about today is how does poor or inconsistent documentation delay or prevent intervention? So I actually have a case that has nothing to do with shelters, but everything about behavior that happened actually just recently in Vermont. And in a very sensitive information way, I will precurse this with actually stating that the victim of the attack from this dog is unfortunately now deceased. And this is obviously something that is a worst case scenario and happens very, very infrequently, but they do happen. And there have been fatal injuries in animal shelters. And so I think that even though this happened outside of a shelter setting, it's important to recognize that dogs can be a public safety hazard, and some dogs can escalate to that point. So when we're thinking about poor and inconsistent documentation in that worst case scenario, we were talking about severe injury, or properly or potentially a deceased, whether that's an animal or a person, because maybe we didn't catch all of those warning and flags ahead of time. It is very, very, very even more rare that a dog just suddenly aggresses to that level out of absolutely nowhere, right? So I think a lot of people on here probably know that, but if we're not catching those flags very early on, and having some type of intervention plan in place, we can miss that. On the more regular like situations that we may see is that a lot of our dogs may come in with some mild behavior concerns, or they may have some trauma, they may have some anxiety, and things that we might brush off as pretty normal at the get-go. The longer our length of stay increases, the more likely that chronic stress that they're experiencing from lack of sleep, from maybe lack of social contact or minimal social contact, and all of those pieces, the dog may start to deteriorate behaviorally over that longer period of time. And so, where there are our daily day caretakers or daily caretakers are seeing these dogs every day, it actually becomes a lot harder to spot these escalating behaviors because they're minute often and happening kind of as the dog moves along through the system. And because the folks have developed a rapport and a relationship with that dog, they may not actually be seeing some of those behaviors because the dog has developed a good relationship with that person, and they may not feel the need to display some of those, but a new person coming into the picture might. So that is something I have seen oftentimes. And I think it's important to note that that also happens with folks who have pet dogs and dogs who are sick medically, especially of a long-term disease. So, for example, my dog Charlie, he was a boxer, and Rebecca, I'm just going to mute you, but just so we don't, let's see. Oh, no, wait, no, maybe you are muted. You are muted. I'm sorry. My dog Charlie, who I had right before I moved to Vermont, was diagnosed with cancer. And, being a little bit younger, this is now more than 10 years. Yeah, more than 10 years ago, and not having been through that previously, he had a lot of his cancer went for a pretty long time, and he was steadily slightly declining the whole time. But because I was living through it, taking care of him every day, bringing him to work with me every day, it was a lot harder for me to visually be able to see and identify things that were no longer normal, but in my world were, right? So there is some desensitization for us that occurs, and that can also happen with behavior. So how do we help our staff and our shelters really track to make sure that we are adequately making sure that we are capturing these things to help our dogs from this potential deterioration? And I think obviously the first answer is reducing length of stay. So, you know, without getting into documentation, if there are ways in which we can identify dogs that are coming in who are relatively green or safe, and have no major red flags, we want to really focus on not necessarily having to behavioral evaluate those dogs. We want to kind of just get the information we have and identify that dog as like a green flag dog can go straight to adoption. We really want to move them through that process as quickly as possible. And the reason we want to do that is because there is so much research now that has come out that shows that length of stay is the biggest risk and threat to dogs because of the accumulated stress that can occur. It doesn't mean that we want to throw and move every dog out the door really quickly, but there are dogs that come in that have lived in a house for 7 years, have come in with no real behavior concerns or problems. And those dogs, especially dogs who have lived in a home for a very long period of time, was very bonded to a family. The shelter is especially stressful because this is probably now the most traumatic thing that has happened in their life, and they have lost their most important bond, and we see that deterioration happen really fast. So if we're unable to identify any serious red flags on intake, getting that dog to the adoption floor as quickly as possible is always preferred. And for some dogs, especially if it's going to be one of your bigger, more energetic working dog breeds, we may even want to think about tailoring our policies a little bit. So if that dog's not neutered, can that dog go for adoption and go into foster adopt and then neuter that dog when it gets into a home? Because if we have to wait 10 days or 20 days or, however long it takes for our team to get to that neuter, so a dog comes in on let's say Tuesday night, and the next spay neuter day isn't until the following Tuesday, that is a whole week that dog needs to sit and wait. And we are just accumulating time for that dog to really, really fall apart. So can we get that dog up to adoption, put them foster to adopt, and get them the heck out of the shelter? Um, Okay, so any questions or thoughts, comments, please pop them into the chat. I'm super open to talking about whatever you guys need. But I think what I want to talk about now and shift to is how are we capturing potential red flags? Um, and how we are documenting that in a way that makes sense to everybody and can be seen by everybody who needs to see that information. So the process really starts internally at first with making sure that we have uh, what I would consider kind of like an adoptability criteria. So, what are the ideal dogs that we are sending out to our community, and what behaviors are going to be really difficult for our community members to adopt? So, for example, I know I've said this many times, and some of you guys in here may have heard me say this, but in Vermont, we are a very low population state, and everybody thinks their dog should be off leash anywhere you go. Um, even our parks downtown have people, despite all the signs that say, dogs need to be on leash. People do it anyway because we have such a low population of then law enforcement. There's not a lot of folks to enforce any laws, so regardless of good intentions and what we want, if we have and adopt out a dog who has significant dog aggression, there is a high likelihood that that dog will get into it with another dog at some point in time, regardless of how many precautions people take, right? And then getting outside of the city areas, if we have dogs who are aggressive to other animals, we have a lot of farms here. And so if a dog gets loose and attacks livestock, or, you're even walking your dog down your rural road and, the neighbor down the street has a dog that is just off leash and hanging out all the time, it's a huge issue for us here. That doesn't mean necessarily at a different shelter that dog could be handled safely. So for us here at our local shelters, it is very important that we are screening dogs for that dog to dog aggression and what that looks like and the severity of it, and having to make those choices. So for other shelters, like if you're in New York City or you're in, I don't know, downtown Seattle, having a dog with leash reactivity is going to be really challenging. So that is something where when you get a dog in your shelter who has very extreme leash reactivity, that is going to be a process that needs behavior modification. We need to maybe look at some other outcome placements for that dog. And that's going to be really important. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call. I will call this person back. Okay. So once we kind of figure out what dogs we are thinking about, having to say maybe like we can't adopt this dog to our local community, but we can maybe transport to a different location, work with breed specific rescues, work with foster based rescues, all of those things. It's really important that we then identify, okay, so if we're keeping this dog in the shelter and we're moving them through our adoption process, what information are we now going to document to make sure that we are giving the dog the care that they need? So to guide that journey for that dog, it's going to be very important that we have some templates set up ahead of time. So that could be in your internal communication systems, but it also could be in uh, in paper format, not everything needs to be in the computer, but we want to have some documentation. So that's going to be really helpful so that there's a standardized process. It's not like somebody has to sit and read through six paragraphs of information. It gives you really clear information in a snapshot. And then if folks want to continue down to read the more detailed stuff, then we can go ahead and do that. So thinking about our intake process, many of us have the ability to now send forms out ahead of time. Most people do not have printers. So if we are able to get somebody to fill out a form online ahead of time about surrendering their animal, if we're looking at a owner surrender type situation, we can actually get a lot of information before that animal even walks in the door. So by obtaining that information ahead of time, you can assign a point person, or maybe you have a small team who has a very clear list of identifiers of seeing some things in the answer that may raise a flag and create a proactive plan. So as that animal comes into intake, we're able to really dive into some of those more important details instead of waiting until the person is there. One of Trish McMillan's favorite things to say is like, as soon as that person has signed their paperwork and leaves, the chances of getting back in touch with them are often hard, or is often not likely. And it is often hard because they've already kind of gone through that whole emotional piece and we've lost that opportunity. So if we're able to get that information ahead of time, that's going to be helpful. What we can also do with that information when we're thinking about internal pathway planning is we have a dog here who has some maybe mild leash reactivity. We know that leash reactivity and barrier reactivity are very similar. So what we don't want to do is now put that dog on a kennel or in a kennel right on the corner of where the door is. So every dog has to walk past that dog, right? We want to make sure that we put that dog in a space in the shelter in which minimal dogs have to walk by them. And maybe add a visual barrier. So when we get that dog into care, we're able to supplementally already start providing them with some options to address, manage, and potentially be able to slightly modify their behavior when they get in the building. So having that documentation right from the get-go, the intake form, is amazing to be able to proactively plan on kennel placement in your shelter. And additionally, then you can have a I don't know, I guess it could be like a yes, no flow chart for your staff on like if the reactivity, you could even like outline something that's like, um, dog is reactive when he walks by, but easy to redirect with treats. Or if they clarify it, it's like dog gets really worked up and spins in circles and has a hard time letting it go and is still looking for whatever it was reacting to after a minute or two. Um, we know that that's going to be a higher level of reactivity and something that we need to really dig into at that time of adoption. So again, like having those pieces of that documentation, being able to get that included in our snapshot for that dog. So when we have a dog coming into care, we can already set aside a team meeting to monitor that dog, further address and maybe assess that dog. And then those notes and that documentation can then be brought into those team meetings to say, okay, here's what we planned for, here's what we got. Let's make sure that we check in with the staff on how this dog is doing in 5 days, or check in with the staff on how this dog is doing in 6 or 7 days, whatever it is, to make sure that that dog is at least maintaining whatever behavior it came in with and it isn't seeing any of that deterioration. So once the dog is then in care, and I do want to acknowledge if we have a stray animal, we can't do any of those steps. But many of our shelters are taking in a lot of owner surrenders right now. And so I just wanted to go through what that process can look like. If you have a stray animal and or once the animal's in care, that's when we really get into just identifying what behavior we are currently seeing. So one of the things that I really like to do is capture the first 72 hours. So the first 72 hours of a dog's stay is where they're going through like, what am I doing here? How did I get here? Who is my person? Why are there all these people? This food is funny. Is this a Kong? It's like you're going to get a lot of information about that dog in that snapshot while they're kind of going through a variety of emotions. And so I like to have something really simple on the kennels that folks can just kind of fill out and is part of that intake process. So the intake process doesn't really finish until those 2 to 3 days where how were they for leashing? Did they take treats from you? Did they walk? What was their FAS score? I'm really starting to work on incorporating a lot of the FAS scoring just because it's very simple. It's standardized. We can look at a sheet of paper on a wall and identify based on the behavior in front of us, like how closely affiliated that is. And for somebody who's a manager and in a leadership position, you can quickly glance through, if you have, let's say, a report that you print out where somebody's entered the data, you can pull up this dog and like their notes. And let's say they're like a 2 and a 2 and a 2, and all of a sudden there's like a 4. You're like, oh, what happened on that day? And then you can go read those notes. Or you can see that the dog came in at a 4 and was highly stressed and is like 3, 2, 2, 2, 1, right? So we actually see the dog is settling in and doing well. And again, you can go in and kind of then read those additional notes. But at least, especially when we have a staff who's very busy and we don't necessarily have all of the buy-in of taking notes, which I want to very much acknowledge that taking notes on every single dog you interact with at a busy shelter is literally close to impossible. We're at least getting a small snapshot that gives us some data that we can utilize for helping that dog along the way. So those first 3 days, all of those little minute interactions. So like I said, leashing, how do they walk on leash? Do they take treats? Are they affiliative with you? Are they nervous? All of those kinds of things can be very, very helpful. I like to keep those forms pretty basic and just have people circle stuff because depending on your shelter, that might be the best you can get. And sometimes even then people forget to fill it out and you have to piece things together. And so then after that 3 days, we kind of have an idea of who this dog is, and then we can start thinking about what they need in the shelter to then go to the adoption floor from a behavioral perspective. Obviously, it gets a little more complicated when there's like layering medical and behavior, and those cases to tend to go on, for a little bit more. And so, yeah, so that's kind of what I'm thinking as far as documentation purposes. What is really helpful for me as a behavior consultant who can go to shelters is the first things that I'm going to ask for when we have a case of a dog that we're not really sure what next steps are for is not only that I have any information from original intake and their first 3 days and what kind of happened there, but then I do want to see observational notes from staff, medical staff, any volunteers, literally anybody that's really been interacting with the dog regularly or irregularly in the shelter, play groups, those types of things. So we want to be able to accumulate all that information because it tells us a story. One of the mistakes that I see that a lot of shelters do is they only document incidents when they happen. And so that means that we're not really getting information until there was some type of bite or altercation or something like that. And so what is very helpful for me is to see the volunteer notes that say, took so-and-so outside today and it didn't seem like they ate their breakfast. And I think they're feeling a little stressed or lethargic and weren't too interested in training. And I can see if that dog had been happy and fun and having a good time for the entire previous week, and then I have this note, it gives a care indication that like this dog is having trouble. And so if a bite occurs, like very shortly within the window after that note, it's like, okay, well, this dog is actually feeling pretty shitty like 3 days before. So what did we intervene and try to change that? Or did we just allow the dog to continue not feeling well? Is it a medical thing? Is it a behavioral thing? Is the dog just their quality of life is deteriorating with the length of stay? So it kind of gives you a parameter. So to aggregate a lot of that data, we're going to want to have templated note structures for different departments because it's really good to know, like if the dog went into a meet and greet and met a family with children, I want to know how they did, even if those folks didn't take that dog home. Like, how did that meet and greet go? So we want to find quick snapshot ways to do that. So it could be, like I said, written forms, it could be circles. And now with the power of what we have with AI, what we can do is utilize, is we can take pictures and actually use AI to translate actually a lot of our phones do this. You don't even need to use AI. You take a picture on your iPhone and you ask it to pull out the text and then you copy paste the text into whatever Google Doc or pet point or shelter lever, whatever it is, label it as whatever note system it is, and then it's there, right? Like we can utilize these features now, which is really cool. So we want to want like playgroup notes. I think anytime the dog is being restrained or taken to medical, that's really good information about how a dog is going to interact with restraint. everybody's going to need to take their dog to the vet at some point. So if we have a dog who is otherwise perfect but has some challenges with being restrained by strangers, it's a really good thing to know to prepare the adopter. If we're starting to identify the dog has restraint issues, resource guarding, leash reactivity, and is sketchy with other dogs, that's when if we are collecting this documentation from all these different departments and looking at it together to build that full picture, we're going to start thinking about what does the outcome look like. One of the challenges that I see right now in our shelters is for a very long time we had, the matchup two or the safer testing or Sue Sternberg's assess a pet, and we were doing these standardized assessments. And while we've now recognized that those types of behavioral assessments are only really collecting a very small snapshot and are not necessarily the full picture of that dog, it's left a lot of ambiguity about what information is relevant and what behavior is quote unquote euthanasia worthy, right? And I think what I want to help is try to flip that on its head and say, well, let's not think about like what is worthy of euthanasia, because that's going to be different for every person. Um, Especially us in the shelter, we are willing to put up with a lot more of our behavior challenged dogs because we are in this for the long haul. And we have to remember that people coming in to adopt dogs are not looking for a management project. Like, yes, we have our unicorns and we love those folks, but we are not necessarily looking for the management. They're not necessarily looking for that management project. And so what makes the most sense is to think about who your community is and like what their needs are. And then we can kind of go from there and build out like what information do we need to get about this dog. So like a good one is if you live in a city, a lot of people live in condos, and in condos or apartment buildings, you're going to have stairs or elevators. So if we adopt a dog out to someone who they've fallen in love with and the dog can't go up the stairs, um, and they have to pick the dog up and carry it up and down 3 flights of stairs, they might have to return the dog. And it's great to find out that information, but it would be great if we had had that information before, right? So, there are some things that are just within your own community that can be really helpful. So when you're thinking about putting together what type of documentation that you need for your specific shelter, you want to think about your community and what it is that you need to know about this dog to safely place it in your community. And then if the answer is the dog isn't safe to place in your community for whatever variety of reasons, like let's all agree dangerous dogs should be behaviorally euthanized, as sad as that is, because we don't want anybody to really get hurt. And like I said, we just had this situation here just yesterday. Was it yesterday? What's today? Thursday? It was Tuesday night, where a dog killed a human being. And that is obviously, like I said, worst case scenario, but as somebody who's been doing this for so long, it happens more frequently, I think, than I'd like to admit, and that I'd like to know about. And so we have to always think worst case scenario, and make sure that we're keeping our community safe. So, okay, so we're at the dangerous dogs. No, but like I said, we may have a dog who has some leash reactivity that is not going to thrive or do well, and we were asking to put a project onto a person because the environment we would be adopting them to in our community cannot support that animal without behavior modification and potentially medications and all of the things that we need to do for that particular animal. However, we may be able to hook up with some rescues that are in neighboring states or in another part of the state. I live in New England, so all of our states are like an hour from each other. So we just want to think about what are other outcomes and have those and continually cultivate those as you move forward, because you are going to get dogs that are not going to be adoptable in your community but may thrive somewhere else. And I want shelters to stop thinking so like insular that, oh, this dog is not going to work out here. So I think it's really important that we are continually working on cultivating those external resources. So those are all my like general thoughts about documenting what's important. Some thoughts on how to document. Every shelter is going to be a little different. But in essence, what we also definitely want to just make sure that we're doing is helping train our staff on what is objective documentation and feedback about a particular animal and what is subjective. So it is like unhelpful language would be like so and so was so happy today and bounced around all over the place and like there was a ball and they were playing in the water. Like that's not helpful. It's also not succinct. It doesn't really, I mean, it sort of paints a picture, but what I want to know is, this dog didn't appear to be stressed today, that the dog appeared to, enjoy time in the water, spent about 10 minutes doing XYZ, then came out, engaged with me for some treats and pets, etc. So we can keep those things pretty objective and short without making assumptions about how the dog was feeling. So we can say something like appeared to enjoy or was pawing in the water, right? We want to be objective. Another thing that would be really helpful, another objective way to say things is, I went to go get a dog out of the kennel and they seemed like they were scared today, right? Like that doesn't really help paint a picture. But if somebody's like, I usually get so and so out of their kennel. When I opened the door, they backed up and lowered their head. And when I went to put the slip lead on them, they let out a slight growl. So that is going to help identify a little bit better for me, like what that actually looked like. And we can see if that behavior starts to trend and generalize to other people. So again, we're just wanting to think with our staff and talk to our staff and continually reinforce with our staff that objective information is helpful. So when you get in a report from a staff member or an observation and they've given you really good data, we need to remember to remind them like, thank you. This is actually really helpful. I can totally see exactly what happened. This is the perfect way to give me this information. I really appreciate you taking the time to think objectively about this dog, and just continually reinforce that with your staff. Let's see. Let's see. What else did I want to touch on today? Not much. I think that was really actually it. I do think that, behavior documentation is very critical, especially in a time where we, as a sheltering community. Oh, the lights went out. We're as a sheltering community, we're being pressured to really evaluate every dog. We're being pressured to make sure that dogs are safe. Community placements, we're being pressured to meet certain statistics for live release rates. We have pressure from the community to, adopt out every dog that walks through the door. And we have pressure from all sorts of areas. So it is critical that now that we are not using standardized assessments, that we are actually thinking about how are other ways that we can collect appropriate data about this dog and what it looks like. So I think that that's just really important in the direction that sheltering is going. Let's see, what do you suggest to help staff to not use labels? Always a struggle even when teaching staff how to be objective. I think utilizing the fear-free shelters can be very helpful if your staff has not taken those courses. I often actually, this is a fun one. I often see that now that fear-free shelters is so cool and out there and free and people can go through it, a lot of shelters will send their staff through it, but none of the management team ever takes it. So what they learn in the course is never followed up or reinforced on the management end, and then that information just slips backwards and like out of their brains because it becomes so irrelevant to their day-to-day work. So if your shelter is asking and requiring and paying for your staff to take the fear-free shelters course, you damn better have people in management also go through that course and then utilize that language in their day-to-day work, because your staff is only going to be a reflection of your management. And if your management isn't enforcing those things, your staff is not going to feel the need or feel compelled to do it. So that is one. Two, I think, I have to, the one, like, for example, a shelter I was just at, I had taken a dog out of the kennel. And this is a shelter I had been working with on and off for a little while. So I knew some of the staff. I had a little bit of a relationship with them. So this is not how I would handle a like if I was walking into somebody's shelter as a new consultant, I would not talk to the staff directly about these things, but I had been there on and off for a while. And I remember taking a dog out that the staff were scared of. And so I had the dog out, and a staff member comes by and says, "Oh, I'm so scared of that dog." And then somebody else walks by and is talking about a scary incident they had with the dog. It was like arousal based. So again, we're talking about a dog who has specific triggers and acts a certain way when set up in a certain type of environment. And so during that time frame that these staff were standing around telling me about their scary incidents, we had like one or two volunteers walk by. So now those volunteers are also hearing that language. And so I made sure in that moment, I said, "Hey, you know what? Let's talk about this really quick." And that if we start thinking about dogs as scary or happy or friendly, we start to I don't want to say dehumanize. We're anthropomorphizing and creating a personality. Like we're creating this dog's entire temperament out of a situation. Like you're creating a personality trait out of a dog that acts a certain way in a specific circumstance, right? And so we want to be really careful, because if everybody at the shelter hears that Jocelyn went to take the dog out and had a scary interaction, and then Joe went to take the dog out and had a scary interaction, and both of those interactions were occurring when maybe other dogs were walking by, or there was stuff going on in the kennel and the dog was like in a moment of high arousal, and that dog, like then other people in the shelter start to go, "Well, I'm kind of scared to handle that dog. Like that seems unpredictable. Like what do I need to do?" And so in that moment, I taught them that lesson. So I think it's really critical that when we hear our staff talking about dogs, if it's light, I don't intervene. But if I start to hear that it's getting replicated or it gets semi-gossipy, I try to express to them that they're minimizing the personality of the dog by putting a subjective label on them. And sometimes when they realize that if we're here and our goal is to get these animals adopted, and the way you talk about this dog is making them unadoptable, they're actually harming that dog. And if the dog is really scary and you are feeling unsafe, that is the difference. If you feel unsafe to handle a dog because you had an interaction and so did Joe and so did Chris, right? Like that is a concern that we need to address. But if you feel scared or unsafe because you heard Jocelyn talking about a dog who had an interaction, that's different. Like that is just a telephone game. And so yeah, that is something that I feel pretty strongly about. And I'm glad you asked that question. It is just something that you're, especially with new staff, new volunteers coming on, when we're all working together so closely every day, we tend to get lax. And that is up to the management team to continually kindly reinforce that for them and remind them of why it's important, even if it feels better to use more layman's terms on things, that the big picture, it can start to really negatively affect like the whole team and the dog's outcomes. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I do so much better when people ask me questions, so always feel free. I am going to jet though. We're coming up to the end of the time frame here. I know that I had said I was going to be doing some lives the next couple weeks, but I'm going to be I only have a 24-hour turnaround between the NFED conference and then leaving for Expo, and then like another week, and then I think, or no, I'm sorry, Tacoma, and then I'm coming home for a week and then leaving for Expo. So, and then the IABC conference is like a week after that. So there's just gonna be a lot. So I'm gonna work on pre-recording some of these for the next few weeks when I am not available. So you all still have weekly content to watch, even if I am not here to answer those questions. So I'm gonna think of some cool topics. If you have any you're interested in, please again, just shoot me an email, send me a link of like something you read about, and I can just dissect it and it'll be really fun. So please feel free. And if you're going to any of those conferences, let me know, especially for Expo. I want to see if I can do like an SBI meetup where we can all get coffee in the morning or do something fun on site at the conference. So please feel free to also let me know about that. But thank you all for all you do. Thanks for showing up today. And I super look forward to seeing you. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.